Madame Folake had built the sprawling real estate empire now known throughout the country simply as Adekunle Properties. From nothing more than a small plot of inherited land and a stubborn refusal to accept the limitations everyone around her insisted a young widow should accept in a business world dominated entirely by men. She had lost her husband suddenly when Jabari was only 4 years old, left with little beyond a modest inheritance and a determination that her son would never know the particular fear of true poverty she herself had experienced growing up in a household where every meal required careful calculation. She had spent over 3 decades constructing that empire brick by brick, contract by contract, enduring every insult and every closed door with the same quiet, unshakable resolve that had eventually earned her the respect of even her fiercest early competitors, negotiating her first major commercial contract while visibly pregnant with a business partner who had assumed incorrectly that her condition made her an easy target for unfavorable terms. She raised Jabari largely on her own throughout those difficult early years, bringing him along to countless meetings and construction sites long before he could fully understand the significance of what she was building, determined that he witness firsthand the labor and sacrifice required to build something lasting, rather than simply inheriting its eventual comforts without understanding their cost. When she finally stepped back from daily operations to allow her only son, Jabari, to inherit the presidency she had built specifically for him, she had done so with a heart full of hope rather than any lingering doubt about his character. That hope had curdled slowly into concern over the 2 years since Jabari assumed control, concern that deepened further during her extended time abroad, managing the family's growing international investments, concern that finally hardened into determination the moment she returned home and began hearing, through careful and quiet inquiries among her oldest friends within the company, unsettling rumors about the man her son had become in her absence. Former employees spoke of a leadership style built on intimidation rather than inspiration, of junior staff reduced to tears over minor mistakes, of a president more concerned with the brand of his wristwatch and the guest list of exclusive social events than with the well-being of the thousands of employees whose labor sustained the empire he now commanded so carelessly. She confided her growing worry to Chief Adebayo, her oldest friend and the company's co-founder, a man who had stood beside her since the earliest, most difficult days of building the business, and who now served as the elder statesman of the board, respected by every shareholder for his steady wisdom and unimpeachable integrity. "I taught that boy everything I know about humility," Madame Folake said, seated across from Chief Adebayo in the quiet privacy of his study, her voice heavy with a grief that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the son she feared she no longer recognized. "I raised him in the years before this fortune existed, when we still counted every coin carefully, when kindness toward strangers was not a luxury, but a survival strategy in a world that offered us very little grace. I do not know if that boy still exists inside the man everyone describes to me now, or if the comfort I worked so hard to provide him has quietly erased him entirely." "There is only one way to know for certain," Chief Adebayo replied carefully, having anticipated, even before she finished speaking, exactly where her thoughts were leading her. "You built this empire disguised as nothing more than an ordinary woman with an extraordinary will. Perhaps it is time to remind your son what that ordinary woman looks like, without revealing to him that she happens to be his mother. The plan took shape over the following days, deliberate and carefully constructed. Madame Folake would return to the company not as its founder and majority shareholder, a role few current employees would even recognize her by given her many years managing operations quietly from abroad, but as a humble new member of the office cleaning staff introduced under the simple name Mary, her silver hair tucked beneath a plain headscarf, her elegant bearing deliberately dulled into the tired, unassuming posture of a woman who had spent decades performing labor the world rarely thanked her for. Only Chief Adebayo would know the truth of her identity, arranging quietly with the building's facilities management to place her within the cleaning rotation assigned to the executive floor, precisely where her son conducted his daily business, precisely where his true character, stripped of any awareness that judgment might be watching, would inevitably reveal itself. Jabari, meanwhile, moved through his days at the top of Adekunle Properties with the confident, unbothered ease of a man who had never once questioned whether his position had been fully earned or simply inherited. He arrived each morning in a different luxury vehicle, favored elaborate wrist watches that cost more than most of his employees earned in several years, and had cultivated, since assuming the presidency, a reputation among the executive floor for cutting remarks and impatient dismissals that left junior staff bracing themselves whenever his office door opened unexpectedly. His social calendar, once he assumed the presidency, filled quickly with invitations to exclusive galas and business summits, attended almost exclusively by the city's wealthiest circles, and he found himself increasingly drawn toward the validation those circles offered, a validation built entirely on appearances, on the visible trappings of success, rather than the substance his mother had spent decades actually building. He rarely looked directly at employees below a certain rank, addressing cleaners, security guards, and junior assistants with the distracted disregard of a man speaking to furniture rather than people, a habit that had grown more pronounced rather than less as the trappings of his position accumulated around him. It was Bisi, the building's receptionist and administrative assistant, who first noticed the quiet elderly new cleaner assigned to the executive floor, and who, within her first week observing the woman's careful, unhurried work, felt an inexplicable warmth toward her that she could not entirely explain. Bisi had grown up in a working-class household herself, the daughter of a seamstress and a mechanic, and she carried into her professional life an instinctive respect for anyone whose labor kept a place running smoothly, regardless of how little recognition that labor typically received from those positioned above it. She had worked her way into the reception position after 2 years as a temporary administrative assistant, distinguishing herself through a combination of genuine reliability and an unusual willingness to help colleagues at every level of the company, from senior executives to the newest members of the cleaning staff, a quality that had earned her quiet respect throughout the building, even as it occasionally drew skeptical amusement from colleagues who considered her kindness toward junior staff an unnecessary use of her limited free time. "You've been working so hard all morning, Mary," Bisi said one day, approaching the older woman with a cool bottle of water during a brief lull in the reception area's usual busy rhythm. "Please, sit for a moment and rest. No one will think less of you for taking a short break." Madame Folake, maintaining her disguise with careful discipline, accepted the water gratefully, studying the young receptionist's genuine kindness with quiet, growing admiration. "Thank you, my dear," she said, settling briefly onto a nearby bench. "Not everyone in this building extends such courtesy to someone in my position." "That's exactly the problem," Bisi said, lowering her voice slightly. "Some people around here seem to have forgotten that everyone in this building, from the top floor to the basement, is working just as hard to keep this company running. I try to remember that, even when others don't." Madame Folake smiled faintly, filing away the young woman's quiet integrity, alongside the growing collection of observations she intended to carry back eventually to Chief Adebayo. Evidence assembling itself patiently, one small kindness at a time, in stark and troubling contrast to the rumors that had first brought her back into the building at all. In the days that followed, Madame Folake observed her son from a distance no mother should ever have needed to maintain, watching him stride past cleaning staff without acknowledgement, overhear him snap impatiently at a junior assistant who had made an honest scheduling error, witness him complain loudly to a colleague about the inconvenience of sharing an elevator with maintenance workers during their scheduled break. She noted, too, the way his demeanor shifted entirely whenever wealthy clients or important board members entered his orbit, his voice warming instantly into practiced charm, his posture straightening with performative confidence, a transformation so complete and so immediate that it read less like genuine personality and more like a costume he slipped into and out of, depending entirely on the perceived value of whoever stood before him. Each observation landed with a quiet, accumulating weight, though she reminded herself carefully each time that a single moment of impatience did not necessarily reveal the whole of a man's character, that the deeper test would require something more direct, something that placed her own presence squarely within the path of whatever instincts truly governed her son's treatment of people he considered beneath his notice. That moment arrived on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, nearly 3 weeks into her disguise, as Madame Folake wheeled her cleaning cart carefully down the executive floor's polished corridor, her arms tired from a long morning of work that had begun well before dawn. As she rounded a corner near Jabari's office, her cart, its wheel catching unexpectedly on an uneven section of tile, tipped slightly, sending a small bucket of cleaning water spilling across the polished floor just as Jabari emerged from his office, deep in conversation with 2 important visiting investors he had spent the entire morning attempting to impress. The water splashed lightly across the polished tips of his imported leather shoes, and Jabari's reaction was immediate and explosive, his careful, cultivated composure shattering instantly in front of the very guests he had been so eager to charm. "Are you completely incompetent?" he snapped, his voice carrying easily down the length of the corridor, drawing the attention of every employee within earshot. "Do you have any idea how much these shoes cost? How dare you embarrass me in front of my guests with your carelessness?" Madame Folake, her heart aching far more from her son's cruelty than from any physical exertion of her disguised labor, lowered her eyes in practiced deference, offering a quiet, humble apology as she knelt immediately to clean the spilled water, her hands trembling slightly, though whether from age or from the raw pain of witnessing her son's true character revealed so nakedly, even she could not fully separate in that moment. "I am very sorry, sir," she said softly, her voice carrying none of the authority she would ordinarily command in any boardroom in the city. "It was an accident. I will clean it immediately." "An accident that could have cost me this entire partnership," Jabari continued, his voice sharp enough that several nearby employees paused their own work to watch the unfolding scene with visible discomfort. "People like you should be more careful. This is precisely why standards need to be higher for cleaning staff in this building. I want you removed from this floor immediately. I don't care where facilities reassigns you, but I do not want to see your face on my floor again." The visiting investors shifted uncomfortably beside him, one of them murmuring something about the incident being minor. But Jabari, embarrassed and eager to reassert his authority in front of them, pressed forward anyway, his tone growing colder with each passing second. It was Bisi, arriving at the scene moments after the outburst began, who finally could not remain silent any longer, stepping forward from the reception desk with visible determination, despite the obvious risk to her own position. "Sir." "It was clearly an accident," Bisi said, her voice steady despite the tremor of nervousness beneath it. "Mary has worked incredibly hard every single day since she started here. Anyone's cart could have caught on that same uneven tile. Perhaps facilities should repair the flooring rather than punishing her for an accident caused by the building itself." Jabari turned his sharp attention toward Bisi now, clearly irritated at being challenged in front of guests he had hoped would witness nothing beyond his polished authority. "This isn't your concern, Bisi. Return to your desk and let me handle matters that are clearly beyond your position to comment on." "With respect, sir," Bisi continued, her voice trembling slightly but refusing to retreat entirely. "Treating an elderly woman this way, in front of everyone, over spilled water, doesn't reflect well on this company either. I only mean to say that kindness costs us nothing, and cruelty costs us more than we usually realize." The corridor fell into an uncomfortable silence, several employees exchanging uneasy glances, clearly torn between sympathy for Bisi's courage and fear of the consequences such open defiance might invite from a president known throughout the building for his thin patience toward dissent. Jabari, his face reddening with a mixture of embarrassment and anger, opened his mouth to respond sharply. But before he could speak further, Chief Adebayo, alerted by an employee who had rushed to find him the moment the confrontation began escalating, arrived at the scene with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had witnessed far worse conflicts throughout his decades with the company. "Jabari," Chief Adebayo said, his voice carrying easily enough to end the confrontation without need for raised volume. "Perhaps this conversation is better continued in your office, away from guests who came here to discuss business partnerships, not witness one." Jabari, recognizing the older man's authority even in his agitated state, nodded stiffly and gestured his investors back toward his office, though not before casting one final irritated glance toward Madame Folake, still kneeling quietly on the floor, cleaning up the last traces of spilled water with the same patient dignity she had carried throughout the entire humiliating exchange. Chief Adebayo lingered a moment longer, kneeling briefly beside Madame Folake under the guise of ensuring the elderly cleaner was not injured. And in that brief private exchange, unseen by the dispersing crowd, he murmured quietly, "I believe you have your answer now, old friend." Madame Folake nodded slowly, her expression carrying a grief far heavier than any physical exhaustion the morning's labor had produced. "I believe I do," she said softly. "It is time to finish what we started." The company's annual general meeting of shareholders, scheduled to take place only 2 weeks later, provided the perfect stage for the revelation Chief Adebayo and Madame Folake had carefully planned from the very beginning of the disguise. The meeting was held, as it was every year, in the company's grandest conference hall, its long table surrounded by leather chairs occupied by board members, major shareholders, and senior executives, the walls lined with framed photographs documenting the company's decades of growth, several of them featuring a much younger Madame Folake standing proudly beside early construction projects that had eventually grown into the towering developments now bearing the family name. Jabari, unaware that anything beyond routine quarterly business awaited him, arrived at the meeting dressed in his finest tailored suit, prepared to deliver a confident presentation on the company's continued growth under his leadership, entirely unaware that his mother, dressed once again in the elegant, commanding attire befitting her true position, sat quietly among the gathered board members and major shareholders, waiting patiently for the appropriate moment to arrive. Jabari's presentation proceeded smoothly through its early sections, boasting confidently of expanded market share and impressive quarterly profits, until Chief Adebayo rose from his seat at the appointed moment, interrupting the presentation with the calm, deliberate authority that had commanded respect throughout every boardroom he had ever entered across 5 decades of business leadership. Before we continue further, Chief Adebayo said, I believe there is a matter of company culture and leadership integrity that deserves this board's attention, one considerably more important than quarterly profit margins. Jabari, caught off guard, glanced uncertainly toward the older man. Chief Adebayo, with respect, perhaps this can wait until after the formal presentation concludes. It cannot wait, Jabari, Chief Adebayo replied evenly, because the person most affected by this particular matter is sitting in this very room, and has waited long enough already for the truth to be spoken plainly. Madame Folake rose slowly from her seat near the back of the room, and as she stepped forward into the light streaming through the boardroom's tall windows, several longtime board members gasped audibly, recognizing instantly, despite her many years abroad, the unmistakable presence of the woman who had founded the very empire they now governed. Jabari's face drained of color as his mother approached the front of the room, her bearing commanding, her expression carrying neither anger nor triumph, only a deep, unmistakable sorrow. "Mother?" Jabari stammered, rising unsteadily from his own seat. You're supposed to be abroad. What is this? What's happening?" "I returned 3 weeks ago, Jabari," Madame Folake said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent boardroom, "though not as the woman you see before you now. I returned as Mary, the elderly cleaner you humiliated in front of important guests only 2 weeks ago, over nothing more than an accidental spill of water." The color that had already drained from Jabari's face seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by a horrified, dawning comprehension as the memory of that corridor confrontation, the sharp words, the cruel dismissal, the demand that she be removed from his floor entirely, assembled itself with devastating clarity before the entire board of shareholders. "That was you," he whispered, barely audible. "The cleaner Mother, I had no idea. If I had known—" "That is precisely the problem, Jabari," Madame Folake interrupted, her voice steady despite the visible pain beneath it. "You should not have needed to know my true identity to treat me or anyone else in that position with basic human decency. I did not disguise myself to trick you, my son. I disguised myself to see honestly and without performance the man you have become when you believe no one of consequence is watching. And what I witnessed broke my heart considerably more than any spilled water ever could have." Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and one of the company's longtime shareholders, an elderly woman who had known Madame Folake since the earliest years of the business, spoke up quietly. "Was there anyone in this building who treated you with kindness without knowing who you were?" Madame Folake's expression softened slightly at the question, and she nodded. "Yes. One young woman, Bisi from the reception desk, spoke up in my defense that very day, risking her own position to challenge her president's cruelty publicly. She offered me water and kindness every single day I worked on that floor, expecting absolutely nothing in return. If this company wishes to know what genuine character looks like, I would suggest looking toward her example rather than toward the boardroom currently seated before me." Jabari stood in stunned, humiliated silence as the weight of the entire board's collective judgment settled over him. Understanding, with a clarity that arrived far too late to undo the damage of that single corridor confrontation. Exactly what his mother's elaborate test had revealed about the man he had allowed himself to become since inheriting a position he had never fully earned through character alone. The board will need to discuss appropriate next steps regarding leadership, Chief Adebayo said quietly, addressing the room while still maintaining a measured respect toward the young man whose failure he had just helped expose. But I believe, before any formal decisions are made, Jabari deserves the opportunity to speak. If he has anything genuine to offer this board beyond the presentation he arrived prepared to deliver. Jabari remained silent for a long, agonizing moment, his carefully cultivated confidence entirely stripped away, before finally speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say that could possibly undo what I did. I built my entire identity around this position, around being seen as powerful and untouchable. And somewhere along the way, I forgot everything you tried to teach me growing up, Mother. I forgot that the people who clean these floors and sit at these reception desks are not beneath me. I forgot because it was easier to forget than to remember where we came from. Madame Folake studied her son carefully, searching his expression for any trace of performance, any calculated attempt to salvage his position through practiced contrition rather than genuine reflection, and found to her cautious relief something that looked considerably more like real anguish than rehearsed apology. Forgetting is a choice, Jabari, she said finally, made easier by comfort, but a choice nonetheless. The question now is not whether you forgot, but whether you are willing to remember consistently when comfort no longer excuses cruelty. The board convened privately following the dramatic revelation, ultimately deciding, at Madame Folake's own careful recommendation, not to remove Jabari from the company entirely, but to strip him of his presidency and reassign him to a considerably more modest operational role within the company's property management division. Work that would require him to interact directly on a daily basis with the very maintenance staff, cleaners, and junior employees he had spent 2 years learning to overlook. Chief Adebayo assumed the interim presidency himself, while the board initiated a search for a permanent successor, a search that, to the surprise of many longtime employees, ultimately turned toward Bisi, whose quiet integrity and evident leadership potential had not gone unnoticed by Madame Folake throughout the weeks of her disguise. Bisi, initially overwhelmed by the unexpected offer to join the company's management training program with a clear path toward eventual senior leadership, accepted cautiously, guided closely by Madame Folake herself, who took a personal interest in mentoring the young woman whose simple kindness had done more to restore her faith in the company's culture than any boardroom strategy session ever could have. You saw me as a person before you knew I held any power at all, Madame Folake told her during one of their early mentoring sessions. That instinct is worth more to this company than any degree or credential, Bisi. I intend to make sure it is recognized and rewarded properly rather than taken for granted the way it so often has been. Jabari, humbled by his reassignment, struggled initially against the unfamiliar discomfort of a position that required considerably more manual effort and considerably less deference from those around him. But gradually, over the following months, something in his demeanor began to shift. He found himself working alongside maintenance staff who had once feared his presence on the executive floor, learning their names, their circumstances, the quiet dignity of labor he had previously dismissed entirely. And slowly, awkwardly, he began extending toward them the same basic respect he had once reserved only for those he believed could benefit his own advancement. He sought out Madame Folake one evening, nearly 6 months after the shareholders' meeting, that had upended his career so completely, finding her in the quiet garden of the family estate where she had returned to spend her retirement years. "Mother," he said, sitting beside her on the same bench where she had once confided her fears to Chief Adebayo, "I don't expect forgiveness simply because time has passed, but I wanted you to know that I understand now, in a way I clearly didn't before, what you were trying to teach me all those years ago." Madame Folake studied her son for a long moment, searching for the same genuine anguish she had recognized in the boardroom months earlier, and found this time something steadier, something that had clearly been tested and refined through months of humbling, unglamorous work, rather than simply spoken in a moment of panic. "Understanding is not the same as forgiveness, Jabari," she said gently, "but it is the necessary foundation forgiveness eventually stands upon. I am proud of the effort I have watched you make these past months. Continue making it, consistently, and in time, I believe we will find our way back to each other properly." Years later, when Jabari eventually earned his way back into a senior leadership position within the company, this time through genuine demonstrated character rather than simple inheritance, employees throughout Adekunle Properties still told the story of the arrogant young president who had humiliated an elderly cleaner without knowing she was his own mother, always concluding the tale with the same quiet lesson that had reshaped the company's culture ever since. That true leadership reveals itself most clearly, not in how a person treats those who can advance their ambitions, but in how they treat those who, as far as they know, never can.